Emily Grayson, 40 years old, was a respected teacher in Willow Creek. She was known for her kindness and dedication to her students, actively involved in charity work and community events. On the surface, her life seemed perfect, but behind this facade were personal struggles. Michael Grayson, 55 years old, a successful restaurant chain owner, spent much of his time working. His marriage to Emily appeared stable to outsiders. But in reality, their relationship had grown cold and distant. Townspeople had noticed that their family hadn't been as close as they once were. Jacob Grayson, 19 years old, their adopted son, was taken in by the Graysons after his mother's death. He had always been a quiet and withdrawn teenager. Over the years, he felt like an outsider in the family and gradually developed growing resentment toward his adoptive parents. Recent attempts to attend college were unsuccessful, and he withdrew further into himself, displaying troubling signs of detachment. In May 2019, Emily sought help from a family therapist due to the growing tension with Jacob and the strain in her marriage. That summer, after a serious argument, Jacob suddenly left home, further escalating the family's issues. Despite the outward appearance of normalcy, the tension in their home continued to build, laying the groundwork for the tragedy that soon followed. Emily Grayson was a prominent figure in the small town of Willow Creek. She started working as a teacher at the local middle school in 2005, quickly earning the respect of her colleagues and the love of her students. Her lessons were always engaging, and she took a personalized approach with each child. In 2012, she initiated the Second Chance program, helping troubled teens rehabilitate and successfully complete their education. Colleagues and parents praised her for her contributions to youth development, and city officials awarded her several times for her work in education. Emily was also heavily involved in town life. Each year, she organized charity events for families in need, raised funds for the local animal shelter, and often volunteered at various community events. In 2018, she became the head of the town's festival committee, organizing the largest City Day celebration in its history. Her energy and optimism inspired many. And on the surface, it seemed that Emily was a happy and successful woman. Emily had been married to Michael Grayson, a successful restaurant chain owner, for 15 years. Their wedding in 2004 had been a major event in the small town of Willow Creek. Michael provided a luxurious lifestyle, a beautiful house with a garden, vacations at resorts, and dinners at the finest restaurants. But over time, their relationship began to change. Starting in 2015, friends began to notice that Michael was spending more and more time working or traveling. Emily was often left home alone, and a sense of emptiness began to take hold in her life. She rarely spoke about her feelings, and only her close friend Laura Miller knew that Emily's marriage hadn't been as strong as it appeared for quite some time. In recent years, the couple had grown apart, and this became especially noticeable in 2019, when Michael missed their anniversary, citing urgent business in another city. Neighbors noticed that Emily had become more withdrawn and introspective, and conversations about their perfect home life began to fade. Jacob had been adopted by the Graysons when he was 12 years old. In 2012, his mother, Emily's close friend, had died in a car accident. Emily and Michael decided to take him into their family, and at first, the relationship between him and Emily was warm. Emily saw in him a chance to give love, perhaps to fill a void she couldn't express in her marriage. She was actively involved in helping him adapt to his new life and focused on his education. However, as Jacob grew older, he became more withdrawn. By 2017, his behavior had changed. He began avoiding contact with his adoptive parents, spending more and more time alone in his room. Emily noticed that Jacob had started showing strange signs of attachment to her, which went beyond typical family relationships. He would often watch her, write down what she said, and even occasionally argue with Michael in her defense. Emily tried to understand his feelings, but grew increasingly anxious as the tension continued to rise. By 2019, Jacob, now 19, was experiencing deep emotional difficulties. His attachment to Emily had turned into an obsession. He began to display bouts of aggression and jealousy, particularly toward Michael, whom he felt didn't care enough about his adoptive mother. No one, including Emily, realized that this tension would soon escalate into something much darker and more dangerous. In the fall of 2018, Jacob turned 18. This was a turning point not only in his life, but also in his relationship with Emily. Jacob, who had always harbored strong feelings for her, began to see their relationship differently. In September 2018, Emily noticed that his attachment had become more intense, but she convinced herself that it was just a result of his trauma from losing his mother. The situation worsened in December 2018 when Emily, feeling increasingly lonely due to Michael's growing distance, found herself thinking more and more about Jacob. He had become her source of emotional support, something she had been missing in her marriage. By winter 2019, their relationship began to shift to a new level. In February, Jacob prepared a dinner for Emily while Michael was away on a business trip. This was one of the first times Jacob made a move toward closeness, and Emily, though hesitant, gave in to her emotions. They started spending more time together, walking through town, discussing books and movies, and even going shopping together. But by the spring of that same year, the tension between them had evolved into something more. In March 2019, Emily confided in her friend Laura that she felt confused and didn't know how to handle the new dynamic in her relationship with Jacob. She couldn't tell if it was purely emotional attachment or something much deeper. Between May and June 2019, everything became clear. They began meeting in secret, and their relationship became both romantic and psychologically dependent. Emily felt guilty and morally conflicted, but Jacob, in turn, became increasingly obsessed. He no longer saw her just as a mother figure, but as the object of his desires. Their relationship became something forbidden. Something that was tearing apart both her inner world and his psychological state. Psychologists working on the case later noted that these relationships represented a complex psychological phenomenon. Emily, despite her role as a mother, found solace and youth in Jacob, something she could no longer find in her marriage. With each passing day, she became more emotionally dependent on Jacob, even though she was fully aware that these relationships violated every moral boundary for Jacob. These relationships were far more painful. Psychologists explained his behavior as the result of deep trauma associated with losing his mother and his mixed feelings for Emily. He saw her as a mother, a woman, and an object of obsession. By the spring of 2019, his behavior became even more unstable. He was consumed by jealousy, especially when Michael was around. By the summer of 2019, those around Emily and Jacob began to notice strange behavior. Observant neighbors such as Caroline Steele, a close friend of Emily's, noticed that Jacob was spending more and more time with Emily. In June 2019, Caroline saw Jacob lingering at Emily's house several times, even when Michael was away on business trips. She also noticed that Emily seemed increasingly distracted and often avoided personal conversations. On a few occasions, Caroline overheard long, emotional conversations behind closed doors, with voices growing tense. It started to worry her. But she had no idea that something much more serious was happening beneath the surface. Between July and August 2019, neighbors increasingly heard loud arguments coming from the Grayson household. Jacob grew more irritable, and when Michael returned from one of his business trips, he started noticing changes in Emily's mood. Observers noted that Jacob's behavior was becoming stranger. He began avoiding contact with neighbors, growing more aggressive and withdrawn. By late August 2019, the tension had reached its peak when Michael unexpectedly returned home early from a trip and found Emily and Jacob alone together. Emily tried to smooth things over, but Michael immediately sensed something was wrong. At that moment, their relationships began to unravel before their eyes, and Jacob started acting even more impulsively. October 18, 2019 began like any other day in quiet Willow Creek. Emily Grayson spent her morning at school, teaching as usual, and then headed home around noon. However, by evening, it became clear that something was wrong. 30 p.m., Michael Grayson called the police, reporting that his wife was missing. He said that when he returned home, Emily was nowhere to be found, and he couldn't reach her by phone. Emily's usual routine included working in her art studio, located in the basement of their home, during the evenings, but this time, she wasn't there. When the police arrived, they immediately noticed the eerie silence and odd atmosphere in the house. There were no signs of forced entry, but something clearly felt off. 0 p.m., detectives descended into the basement, where Emily worked on her art. There, amidst scattered tools and unfinished canvases, they found her body. Emily lay on the floor, strangled with a rope. At first glance, the scene was arranged to look like a suicide. The rope was carefully tied to a shelf, and her body was positioned almost peacefully. But experienced detectives quickly noticed details that didn't add up. Emily's body bore multiple bruises on her wrists and neck, indicating she had fought back. Around her lay broken items, including sculptures and brushes, which clearly suggested a physical struggle. Near the body, they also found shoe prints that did not belong to either Emily or Michael. These small but crucial details made it clear to the police. This wasn't a suicide, it was a carefully planned murder, staged to look like one. The police launched an investigation with a meticulous examination of the crime scene. The following morning, October 19th, detectives uncovered another crucial piece of evidence inside the house, Emily's diary hidden in her bedroom. This diary became a turning point in the case. In it, Emily detailed the last few months of her life, describing Jacob's strange and increasingly threatening behavior. She wrote about how she had begun to fear him, noting that Jacob often watched her at night and had become more aggressive in recent weeks. One of the entries, dated October 5, 2019, was particularly significant for the investigation. In it, Emily described an incident where she noticed Jacob watching her through the window of her studio late at night. She also wrote about her attempts to end their dangerous relationship and how Jacob refused to accept her decision. Emily was on the verge of despair, but was too afraid to tell Michael what was really going on. She even considered leaving town, but didn't know how to do so without completely destroying her family's life. The discovery of Emily's diary was an unexpected twist in the investigation. Now the police had evidence that the relationship between Jacob and Emily had been tense and dangerous. Investigators who initially suspected possible motives tied to financial issues or marital disputes between Emily and Michael shifted their focus to a new theory, premeditated murder by Jacob, driven by his obsession with Emily. According to data found on Jacob's phone, the police learned that shortly before the murder, on October 17th, there had been a heated exchange between him and Emily. Emily had firmly tried to end their relationship, stating that they couldn't continue this way and that she no longer wanted to hide the truth from Michael. In response, Jacob sent her a threatening message. "You can't just walk away. You belong to me." This text became a critical piece of evidence linking him to the murder. When the police questioned Jacob on October 20th, he initially denied any involvement in Emily's disappearance, claiming he hadn't seen her since the morning of October 18th. However, under the weight of evidence, the diary, text messages, and clues from the crime scene, his story began to fall apart. Detectives noticed that he grew increasingly nervous whenever the topic of his relationship with Emily came up, and by the end of the interrogation, it was clear that he was hiding something. On October 25, 2019, exactly 1 week after Emily Grayson's tragic death, Willow Creek Police received an emergency call from Michael Grayson's office. A company employee arriving for work in the morning found his lifeless body on the office floor. At first glance, it appeared to be a robbery. The office door had been forced open, papers were scattered across the floor, and the safe containing money and important documents had been emptied. Initially, investigators thought it was a random crime, but soon details emerged that pointed in a different direction. Michael had a hidden camera in his office, installed for security after recent threats against his business. When detectives reviewed the footage, they saw an unknown figure dressed in dark clothing and a mask enter the office just minutes before the murder. The person acted quickly and with purpose, dispelling the theory of a random burglar. Moreover, the way the killer moved suggested they knew exactly where the safe was and what documents to target. This was not typical of a robbery. It soon became clear that Michael's murder was connected to Emily's case. Detectives began to examine Michael's connections and returned to his relationships with his wife and Jacob. It increasingly appeared that the two crimes were no coincidence and could be part of a larger, complex plan. As the investigation continued, a new and unexpected figure came to light. Sarah Wilson, a young woman who worked in the accounting department at Michael's company. At first, Sarah seemed like a typical employee, but after a more thorough examination of her phone records and messages, the police discovered that she had been involved with both Michael and Jacob. This revelation shocked everyone. It turned out that Sarah had been Michael's lover for quite some time, with their relationship beginning back in 2017. She frequently visited his office after work, and their affair remained a secret, even from those closest to them. But what was even more shocking, she was also involved with Jacob. In text messages dated during the summer of 2019, Sarah flirted with Jacob, and their conversations revealed that they discussed Emily and their plans for the future. Investigators concluded that Sarah might be the link between the two murders. On October 23, 2 days before Michael's death, Sarah met with Jacob at a cafe near his house. Surveillance footage captured them engaged in a lively conversation that lasted over an hour. This raised suspicions that they could have been planning their next steps after Emily's murder. Sarah was playing a dangerous game, manipulating both Michael and Jacob. She promised love and support to one while convincing the other that they could be together if Emily was out of the picture. However, by the fall of 2019, the situation had spiraled out of control. Emily's murder hadn't resolved the issues between Jacob and Sarah, and now they were entangled in a cycle of violence from which there seemed to be no escape. On October 28, 2019, 3 days after Michael Grayson's murder, detectives Leanne Blake and John Peterson began carefully analyzing the evidence and the connections between all the participants in the tragedy. Clues gathered from surveillance footage and mobile devices allowed them to slowly unravel the events. The police had already learned that Sarah Wilson was not just Michael's lover, she had also been skillfully manipulating Jacob, exploiting his emotional instability and obsession with Emily, to execute her own sinister plan. The revelation of Sarah's motives marked an unexpected turning point in the investigation. As detectives reviewed her correspondence with Jacob, it became clear that she had intentionally preyed on his weaknesses. She gained his trust, using his feelings for Emily, convincing him that after Emily's death, they could be together and start a new life. These messages, dating from July and August of 2019, showed how Sarah methodically led Jacob toward the idea of killing Emily, convincing him that it was the only way out of their situation. Jacob, consumed by his passion for Emily and Sarah's promises, became the perfect pawn in her scheme. Sarah masterfully orchestrated the situation, leading Jacob to believe that eliminating Emily would free them both. In August 2019, she sent him a message that read, "We can only be together when this is all over. You know what needs to happen." These words became key evidence of Sarah's critical role in driving the events forward. Even after Emily's death, Sarah continued to manipulate Jacob, convincing him that they could start a new life together, but only after they dealt with one final obstacle, Michael. They held secret meetings where they discussed the next steps. And Jacob, now completely under Sarah's control, began planning the murder of his adoptive father. Sarah remained behind the scenes, continuing to use Jacob as her puppet. On October 22, 2019, just days before Michael's murder, Sarah began applying more pressure on Jacob. Their conversations were filled with mentions of how Michael supposedly suspected them, and that if they didn't act soon, their entire future would be destroyed. Sarah intensified the pressure, playing on Jacob's fears that he would lose her and end up alone. All of this led Jacob to commit the murder, believing he was acting out of love for Sarah and to protect their future. However, Sarah already had a different plan for the future. On October 25, the day after Michael's murder, she began planning her escape. Her plans included eliminating Jacob to ensure there were no loose ends that could lead back to her. Sarah knew that Jacob would eventually start to panic and make mistakes, which could jeopardize her safety. She intended to stage his death as a suicide, tying up all the remaining loose ends. Sarah started looking for an opportunity to lure Jacob to a secluded location where she could execute her plan. In their final text exchange, dated October 26, she suggested they meet at his parents' house, reassuring him that it would be their new beginning. As always, Jacob agreed, unaware that he was about to become her next target. However, the next day, on October 27, the police received an anonymous tip implicating Sarah in both murders. This call disrupted her plans. Detectives began closely monitoring her movements and intercepted several phone calls, which revealed that Sarah was planning to flee. On October 28, just hours before her planned meeting with Jacob, the police arrested Sarah. On October 28, 2019, following Sarah's arrest, the police also detained Jacob. He was found in his apartment in a state of extreme stress and anxiety. Jacob did not resist arrest and appeared broken. Detectives noticed that he had started to realize the full scope of his actions. Sarah, on the other hand, remained cold and refused to admit to anything. The trial began on January 15, 2020. Sarah and Jacob faced charges for the murders of Emily and Michael Grayson. The prosecution built its case on the premise that Sarah was the mastermind, skillfully manipulating Jacob to achieve her goals. Prosecutor Jane McKenzie presented evidence showing that Sarah exploited Jacob's emotional instability to convince him to eliminate his adoptive parents, promising him a new life and love that in reality never existed. On January 19th, text messages between Sarah and Jacob were presented in court, revealing how she gradually pushed him toward the murders. These messages demonstrated just how calculated her tactics were, designed to completely control the young man. However, Sarah continued to insist on her innocence, claiming that she never intended to commit murder and that her relationship with Jacob had been misinterpreted. The trial turned into a psychological drama. The prosecution portrayed Sarah as a cunning manipulator whose influence over Jacob was so strong that he fully submitted to her will. Jacob was presented as a victim, a mentally unstable person who would become a puppet in the hands of an experienced manipulator. In court, surveillance footage was shown, capturing Sarah and Jacob discussing the murders just days before Michael's death. This footage had a profound impact on the jury. Sarah appeared nervous, trying to deny her involvement in the conspiracy, but her lies began to unravel as more evidence was presented. On January 25th, psychologists brought in for the trial testified that Jacob suffered from severe emotional problems stemming from childhood trauma and complicated relationships with his adoptive parents. However, his actions were largely attributed to Sarah's strong influence, as she expertly manipulated his mind and convinced him of the false necessity of committing the murders. On February 5, 2020, Jacob unexpectedly gave shocking testimony. During interrogation, he confessed that he had been madly in love with Emily and had hoped that one day they could be together. He openly revealed that Sarah had exploited his obsession and promised him a new life if he helped her get rid of Emily and Michael. Jacob admitted that despite his love for Emily, he acted under Sarah's influence, and his perception of the situation had been completely distorted by her manipulations. This confession hit like a bombshell. Sarah, who had previously denied her involvement, looked shaken and tried to change her defense strategy, claiming that her statements had been made under pressure, but the evidence against her was too overwhelming. After several weeks of interrogations, expert testimony and witness statements on February 20, 2020, the jury delivered their verdict. Jacob was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. In his closing remarks, the judge emphasized that Jacob was a young man suffering from severe psychological disorders and that his actions were the result of deep psychological trauma and manipulation. Sarah, on the other hand, was sentenced to death. Her role as the mastermind and manipulator was deemed particularly egregious by the court. The verdict sparked intense debate in the community and became a shocking conclusion to this complex. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.